Hello, thank you for joining us. I'm Kirsten Axelson, visiting scholar with the American Enterprise Institute. Today, I'm hosting a webinar that is focused on intellectual property for medicines and vaccines, and with a specific consideration to when the US federal government may waive or potentially relax intellectual property protection for medicines during emergencies. I'm joined today by two panelists who are experts and well recognized in this field. And I'm going to start by asking each of them to introduce themselves and give a brief background on how their experience and career has built their expertise in the area of intellectual property in medicine. So I'm going to ask Justice Paul Michel to please begin.
Thank you for the promotion. I actually was only a circuit judge, not a justice on the Supreme Court. I spent 22 years and a little bit more on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. That's the court where all the patent-related disputes and other intellectual property suits get reviewed on appeal. And in the 13 years since retiring in 2010, I've been doing consulting again in intellectual property cases. And I've been very much involved with the Congress on various policy issues going back many years and continuing today relating to patent protections and the impact of patent rights on investment and scientific advance. I'm happy to be part of this discussion.
Thank you. There's still time for the Supreme Court, I'm sure. So Lisa Hale, can I ask you to please introduce yourself next?
Sure. Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you again to AEI for having us on this panel. So I'm a partner at DLA Piper based in the San Diego office in the intellectual property group. And I handle matters relating to patents and agreements. So unlike the judge, I'm a transactional lawyer. I don't typically go to court and try and do everything I can to keep my clients out of court. I've been practicing law for 32 years now, and prior to my legal career, I was in cancer research. So I obtained my PhD in microbiology and immunology from Georgetown University Medical School, and spent several years doing cancer research. So I bring the scientific background as well as the legal background to the table. I work with nonprofit entities, universities, small venture-backed startup companies, up to the larger, more mature pre-public companies. And then on the other side, some of the largest Fortune 100 pharmaceutical companies. So my client base is sort of across the board. But I also work with investors looking at new opportunities in the biotechnology and pharmaceutical space, as well as med device, but I think we'll talk a little less about med device today, as well as working with investment arms of the large pharma companies. So I bring a lot of experience of understanding, what investors are looking for, and in addition, obviously, the patent space.
Thank you so much. I think very often when there are critics of intellectual property protection for biopharmaceuticals, the critique is often aimed at the large biopharma companies. And I appreciate you bringing that experience, given that universities, small biopharma companies, and many other organizations directly benefit and sustain their scientific practice from science that hopefully will yield a new medicine. So to start us off, I'm going to do a brief presentation to give a little bit of background on intellectual property for biopharmaceuticals. And we're going to talk today I'm going to put some questions to my panelists today about the role of intellectual property for drug development and particular types of technologies, and what their view is on some of the recent proposals to reduce intellectual property protection or the ability to seek damages if intellectual property is taken as an approach to expanding affordability for medicines. Many of these proposals have come to light either as a result of the pandemic and an interest in expanding access to essential medicines for health, such as vaccines or preventatives against the exacerbation of COVID infections. And then also with the emergence of new promising specialty drugs that often bear high price tags, there's been increasing interest by policymakers to waive their intellectual property protection to allow the federal government to essentially have others manufacture those medicines. So I'm going to start with a basic overview of intellectual property for medicines and vaccines. I'm not going to even pretend to scratch the surface, given who else I'm joined by today. I'll share some content on what policymakers have been asking for, particularly of Health and Human Services as it relates to intellectual property. And then I will move into the discussion with my panelists today. So just to begin with some very basics, the patent term for a drug is 20 years. The patent is sought during clinical development, so well before this, the compound is a drug, but when it is being investigated in pre-market, in human studies or in animal models. The patent sort of clock begins clicking well before the drug is approved by the FDA. Clinical development generally takes about 10 to 15 years. So when you think about when a drug company would, or the university, whoever holds that potential medicine candidate, it's a careful decision about when to seek the patent for that potential medication soon enough so that someone else can't take it, but also not so soon that the sort of patent clock begins ticking. And the reason is that when the patent and the data protections expire, then the commercial value of the drug diminishes tremendously when generics enter the market, and more than 95% of the revenue is gone from that medication. Clinical data exclusivity is not a patent. It is granted by the FDA when a medicine is approved, and that protects the investment in clinical evidence that a drug company or the clinical trial sponsor has made, and does not allow a generic or biosimilar to enter the market using the safety and efficacy data from the originator, again, until that data exclusivity time has expired. There are certain types of special indications that or events that will allow for longer data exclusivity. For a small molecule, 7 years. It can also be 5 years. And then for a biologic, it was 12 years granted by the Affordable Care Act. Patents and data exclusivity typically are concurrent. So the average time sort of on the market before, after a drug is approved and before there is generic competition is around 14 years for a small molecule. A small molecule is typically a pill, the type of a drug you might pick up at a pharmacy. For a large molecule, that ranges between 15 and 20 years, although the biosimilar, which is essentially, is not a generic biologic, but it is the kind of the analogous to a generic biologic. The biosimilar market is still developing, so we can anticipate probably that time on the market without a biosimilar competitor will be coming down over time as that market develops. And then there are special incentives that increase the data exclusivity that encourage the development of drugs or post-market studies for new or different indications. And examples of that are pediatric studies or orphan drug designations or medicines that treat that help address the antimicrobial resistance issue. So points of debate in intellectual property for medicines on sort of the pro-intellectual property camp. Intellectual property encourages investment in clinical development. Most drugs fail, and it is expensive to develop a new drug. And so without the promise of a financial reward at the end of that development cycle, you would not see universities, academic centers, drug companies, and investors placing their money in the expensive process that is often not successful. And then on the detractor side, they note how inexpensive generics are and how rapidly they proliferate when the intellectual property protections no longer protect the innovator medicine. And they say if we were able to reduce the time the medicine was able to be marketed exclusively, prices would come down and drugs would be more affordable. So a couple of examples of recent calls from policymakers, 2023 letter to Secretary Becerra from Senator Sanders and a number of other senators urged HHS to use a Section 1498 waiver to break the patent on an Alzheimer's medication that they said was both promising and too expensive. And they cited the high cost of that drug as the need for the federal government to break the patent. And I'm going to later ask our panelists to describe what Section 1498 really does, because breaking the patent is not really exactly what that waiver would have allowed HHS to do. But I'm not going to pretend to explain that. I'm going to ask Judge Michel to. And then the senator and other sign-on signatories to that letter also said they were concerned about what would happen to Medicare premiums if the Alzheimer's medication were to be covered at its current price. And there's a 2022 letter from Senator Warren and a number of other signatories urging HHS to use compulsory licensing under 1498 waiver and Marchin Rights and royalty-free rights, again citing the high cost of medicine as the reason to reduce the intellectual property protection on certain medicines. And then, in response to the letter from Senator Warren and the other signatories, a group of academic universities and associations sent a letter to HHS Secretary Becerra saying, that revoking IP or relaxing the ability to seek damages for the destruction of IP would reduce investment in university technology, and that promising innovations would sort of be left behind as they were prior to the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act, when the federal government held university patent rights, but only 5% of those patents were licensed to be used, as cited in this letter. And they cite the importance of university research and academic centers to treatments for HIV, mRNA technology, and others. So I'm going to launch into the questions, but these are sort of the general areas we're going to be covering with my two panelists. What tools does the federal government have to take intellectual property? Is there an argument to be made for taking intellectual property? How would these affect clinical development if intellectual property rights were to be loosened? And what is the flexibility for the federal government to take them? And then, of course, we'll sort of wrap up with what are the key issues facing Congress this year and in coming years as it relates to intellectual property. So I'll stop there. And I'm going to begin with my first question. Is for Paul, and I could ask, could you please give us a brief background on Section 1498 and waivers, particularly as it relates to medicines, including drugs and devices, and what would it mean to waive Section 1498?
Well, the backdrop that needs to be stated is that the Constitution prohibits the government from confiscating private property without compensating the owner. And this started out focused on land way back at the time of the Civil War, when the successful Union government confiscated plantations all over the South. So they created a mechanism for compensating the owners because the Constitution required them to do so in the Fifth Amendment, that concludes by saying private property cannot be taken except when just compensation is paid by the government. So 1498 was the vehicle created by Congress for arranging the compensation that the Constitution requires, and it provides a special court and cause of action and mechanism for achieving that kind of compensation. The court is called the Court of Federal Claims. It sits in Washington, D.C. It's a very unusual, specialized court that just does this kind of compensation work and a few other things as well. So 1498 goes through that court exclusively. And so that's the basic layout of the law. And it looks to me like the proposals by the two senators and a few others who joined them seeks to eviscerate or misuse Section 1498 for the goal of lowering drug prices. I might add quickly that I certainly agree that relief for people to make drugs more affordable is a socially important concern. And the society should do whatever it needs to make sure that people of limited means can get the drugs that they need. But my thought is that eviscerating existing legal regimes is not a proper way to do this. It's also a counterproductive way because it will severely curtail the development of improved versions of existing drugs and other therapeutics. And it will also cut off the progress toward newer and better drugs, including ones completely novel. So a lot is at stake here, both for consumers, for patients, for people with conditions, some of which are very common and very worrisome. But a lot is also at stake for the progress of medicine, which in the last 40 some years since the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act, termed by many people as the most important legislation of the entire 20th century because it was so productive, it spawned the entire emergence of the biotech industry in the United States, which has led the world for decades in this type of medical relief. So again, an awful lot at stake. Now, in theory, and I'll finish with this, in theory, you could make drugs affordable if the government did all the research on taxpayer funds, did all the manufacturing, did all the distribution, and didn't charge anything. But of course, the cost of that would be astronomical, impossible to even express it in words that make any sense. And there's no chance that the taxpayers could pay that or that the Congress would ever vote for that. So instead, we have a largely private system. There is some public money, and it's very important, but the system depends heavily on private funds to be invested in research and development and manufacturing and distribution, and to incentivize the massive private funds required for these continuing and risky investments. The incentives have to be strong. And patents really are an incentive system meant to advance science for the benefit of patients. They're not basically in existence to make a certain company rich. That's a side effect, and not a bad one, if the money is plowed back into research, as it often is to a great extent. So it's a complicated balancing act. It's worked extremely well in recent decades. The proposal by the two senators would upend the entire system and I think have enormous and ongoing effects because there is no limiting principle. If you do this for Alzheimer's drugs, it will be done for other drugs, then it will be done for other medications, then and other therapeutics, and then it will be done for whatever politicians seeking to curry favor with certain groups of voters care to apply it to. So there's no stopping once you set the precedent of broadly confiscating private property rights, which is what patents are, in the quest for lower prices.
Thank you so much. And to your point about government doing R&D and drug distribution, as flawed as the current model of market incentives and unmet need driving those decisions, I would think that if politics were driving decisions on what diseases were treated and the focus of study, it might be even more flawed. So thank you so much for those, for your explanation of what Section 1490 does and what a waiver would mean. I'm going to turn next to Lisa, and could you tell us some of the tools the federal government has and they can take during a public health emergency, specifically as it relates to intellectual property, to ensure the supply of medicines is sustained?
Sure, thanks. So there's actually several steps that the government can use in extreme circumstances to protect, the safety and welfare of the country. There's the Defense Production Act, there's compulsory licensing, and Marchin Rights, and those are typically the three that we think of, which are means for authorizing the government to step in and assert rights against private companies, including patent rights. So the Defense Production Act was from 1950. This was during the Korean War, and it was to give the government more control in emergencies to direct industrial production, for example, steel or ammunition. So it made sense at the time. And under the act, the president can require certain manufacturers to prioritize the production of certain supplies or services that are necessary, typically for national defense. But in fact, we did see this during the pandemic when President Trump had the production of masks and ventilators accelerated under the Defense Production Act, but we don't see it used as often these days. With compulsory licensing, the U.S. doesn't have a specific provision for compulsory licenses, but what this means is that a company can get a license to produce and market, in this case, a generic version of a drug, even if the drug is still covered by a patent. And the patent holder should get compensation from the government. The typical conversation is in terms of royalties, but the patent holder doesn't have a say in who gets to use these patent rights. So the possibility of compulsory licensing has surfaced in certain situations. For example, back in 2001, as you may recall, when letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to various US senators and media outlets, the government took a close look at a drug that was being produced by the pharma company Bayer called ciprofloxacin, or Cipro. And it was considered the best antibiotic at the time for treating anthrax. And the government did consider stepping in and requiring compulsory licenses to have other manufacturers make Cipro, because Bayer was uncertain that they would be able to meet the demand if the anthrax scare accelerated. The compulsory licensing was not invoked. It was not, the health scare that I think we thought it was. But more recently, there were discussions around compulsory licensing again during the pandemic with Gilead's antiviral drug called remdesivir, which had been developed for the Ebola virus, and it was tested and found to be effective for use with the COVID-19 pandemic. But again, the compulsory licensing was not invoked. The government did not step in. And then, so the final one that I want to speak about is Marchin Rights. And as Judge Michelle commented on the Bayh-Dole Act, which is really significant in this industry, it was passed in 1980, and it provides the government with what are called Marchin Rights, which allows the government to step in as the funding agency. So for example, many grants are given by the National Institute of Health, NIH, to university professors doing scientific research. And essentially it says the government can ignore the exclusivity of a patent that was awarded to an inventor and grant these additional non-exclusive licenses to what is termed reasonable applicants. So in other words, Marchin Rights would give the federal government the right to grant other entities a license or give a license to itself for a patented invention if it was made with government funding. As with compulsory licensing, if Marchin Rights are used by the government is required to provide, again, reasonable compensation to the patent holder. And I think we'll talk a little bit later about this issue with reasonable compensation. But while there have been various letters sent to NIH from the public, from members of Congress to exercise Marchin Rights, there was a drug by Abbott, which was related to a prescription drug used for AIDS back in the early 2000s. And Abbott had increased the price by like 400%. And there were entities pushing for NIH to, or the government to invoke the Marchin Rights to try and reduce the drug prices. The NIH denied the petition, finding these were not grounds to exercise Marchin Rights. And this is important for our discussion today. The same thing happened with another drug from Pfizer, a glaucoma drug. And same thing, NIH said, this is an extraordinary remedy to exercise Marchin Rights, and it's not appropriate for controlling drug prices. So some of this precedent is key to the conversation today, even though these occurred 20 years ago. So it's a good reminder that this isn't a new problem necessarily, although the discussion around 1498 is obviously rearing its head again. But the likelihood of Marchin rights being exercised by the government has always been very low. And in fact, the government has never exercised such rights, even though they were introduced over 40 years ago. I would say with the pandemic, the likelihood probably rose a little more than what we've seen in time as far as Marchin rights or the potential for compulsory licensing. But even with that, these rights were still not exercised. So I think that's important.
Thank you so much. And then, so related to that question for Paul, could HHS exercise that right and waive Section 1498, sort of disallowing a company the ability to seek damages if the goal was to lower drug prices, if sort of that was the emergency that were being addressed by that waiver? What are sort of the legal arguments for and against HHS being able to do that?
Well, my understanding of settled law is that the Marchin rights are, number one, not authorized as a means of price control. They're only authorized where the supply is deficient to meet the need. So if there is an exclusive licensee to a patent that's under the Bayh-Dole regime, the Marchin rights only apply if the exclusive licensee is not able to meet the need of patients for the quantities of drug involved. And to my recollection of the history, that's never been established as the fact. And that's one of the big reasons that Marchin rights have not been exercised. And there's a great deal of legislative history and some subsequent editorial writing by the named authors of the bill, former Senator, the late Senator Dole and Bayh, in which they emphasize that it was never the intent of the Bayh-Dole Act to be a vehicle to control prices, and that the Marchin notion was only included for the extreme emergencies when the quantitative needs for the drug could not be met fast enough by the exclusive licensee. And as I said, factually, that's never occurred. But I think it's very significant that they emphasized, in the legislative history that's documented in the 1980 bill also supports the idea that it was never to be a price control vehicle at all under any circumstances. So it looks to me like the suggestion to trigger, to have the Secretary of HHS to trigger the Bayh-Dole Marchin rights requires an abuse of the statute and an action by the government that's completely inconsistent with the mandate from Congress as it's been understood and interpreted not only by the originators of the legislation, but by all the courts that have looked at it ever since.
Thank you. So Lisa, you work with universities, drug companies, and investors. What's important to investors as it relates to patents and intellectual property protections, including data exclusivity? And can you, comment a bit on how this affects investment in drug development, how it affects M&A, and in particular for smaller biotech companies who may only have one, promising or one or two promising drug candidates?
Yeah, absolutely. And just as a reminder, I know you had the opening slides, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I think it's important that a patent is a right granted by the government to an inventor that allows the patent owner to exclude others from making, using, selling the invention. It's not actually a positive right to be able to do something, but it's the right to exclude others from making, using, and selling the invention for a certain amount of time. And as you mentioned, it's 20 years from the date of filing an application. In exchange for the patent, the inventor has to disclose what the invention is and provide enough detail so that others can understand what the invention is. So that's important as we continue this discussion. But many of the drugs and biologics and methods of treatment for diseases are first developed in a university setting, in a nonprofit environment, and ultimately will be spun out into a startup company or potentially in-licensed by a biotech or pharma company. The biopharma industry requires this sort of coordinated infrastructure that includes universities, nonprofits, investors, biotech and pharma companies, service providers, and it really operates almost like a fine-tuned orchestra. And you see these highly successful environments and infrastructures in the leading markets in the US for biotech and pharma. So cities like San Francisco, Boston, San Diego, where you've got that infrastructure. And as you mentioned, much of it does begin in the university setting. For an early stage biotech company or pharma, it's usually a biotech, but a pharma company, it is assumed by investors that you either have or you're in the process of obtaining a patent or a license to a patent. And this is because early on, there are no tangible approved products, and an investor can ascertain the value of a company, at least in part, based on their intellectual property position, based on their patents. And so for an early stage company, the patent is really one of its most valuable assets. So when we perform, IP diligence, for example, for investors looking at new opportunities, new technologies, new drugs, new biologics, there's no question that one of the first key, boxes to check off is, what is the IP position? What are the patents? What are the patent opportunities for this technology or for this drug? They want to see that a company they're investing in has a competitive advantage. So they're comfortable that at some point down the road, they're going to get a return on their investment. So patents are critical to investors. Similarly, if we're working with biotech or pharma companies that are looking to acquire a new asset or even a research program or company, they'll want to see issued patents or at the very least pending patent applications. And given that, like the rest of the world, we're now a first to file country in the US, patent applications are filed typically fairly early in the process of the research. And then throughout the research and development phase of a new drug, for example, patent applications will be filed to cover the drug itself or the molecule itself, and then methods of synthesizing or manufacturing that drug, methods of using it for treatment for various diseases. Typically, there's a first indication and then followed by secondary and other indications. There'll be patent applications filed for new formulations, for various routes of administration. So for example, many drugs today that are injectables, which is not as convenient, are being reformulated in an oral form. So there will be new patent applications filed on those new routes of administration. And so patent applications are filed all along the way from research and development through clinical trials where you may gain some insight into dosing and dosing regimens. So there will be multiple patents that cover a product. And I think one thing that really needs to be appreciated is this isn't sort of a linear process where there's one patent that covers one drug. And I think this will make a lot more sense with some of my comments to follow. But as you can appreciate, when a drug goes from that initial research stage through development, through the clinic, and ultimately receives FDA marketing approval, you've eaten away at that 20-year term because the clock was ticking since day one. So it's critical to have these patents that cover, and a family of patents that cover a product. And, working with investors, I obviously have to say there's no assurances that patents will stand up in court or be defensible, or whether they'll issue with the claim scope that will block competitors. But investors want to understand at least what that level of risk is with respect to the strength and enforcement of the patents, and understand how easy or difficult it might be for a competitor to design around them. But the answers to those questions when I'm doing diligence is somewhat predictable. Given experience and given precedent, it is somewhat predictable. But in the absence of patents, it's going to make it very difficult for investors or an acquirer in the context of M&A to get interested in spending millions of dollars to try and move a drug forward through to the clinic and onto regulatory approval if there's uncertainty or instability around our patent system that's, for today, based on this discussion of the misuse of Section 1498, and it most certainly will have a negative impact on investment and innovation in this sector.
Kirsten, could I just add 2 footnotes to Lisa's very thoughtful survey of the scene? One is that at all of the successive stages she outlines, typically further investments are needed. It's not one investment at the beginning, it's investment after investment after investment, usually of increasingly large amounts. And if the risks of no return get too high, the investment stops and the development withers on the vine in midstream. Secondly, it's one thing to focus on the U.S. market, as we've been doing, and understandably so, as a matter of emphasis. But if you look globally over the last 40 years, the U.S. biopharma industries have dominated the world and produced vast portions of the advanced medications commonly used all over the world. So the success of the Bayh-Dole system has been demonstrated for 43 years, and it's dramatic. It's extreme. And the idea that we want to throw that system out the window because we want to have lower costs to patients, to me is dubious, to put it kindly. There are other better ways to make drugs affordable than killing the incentive system that makes the drugs available in the first place. So I think the letter writers have it exactly backward.
Thank you so much. In fact, to follow on, and I'll put this first to Paul and then to Lisa, what are the key intellectual property issues facing Congress right now? These letters from the senators asked HHS to invoke what they felt were existing rights, but are there changes in law that are being considered in this year or the coming years that you think are particularly important to raise, and that biopharmaceutical companies, people who depend on medicines, and investors should be aware of?
Well, there's a plethora of proposals in front of Congress, as there always is. I spent 9 years as a Senate staffer before becoming a judge. So I saw how this process works. Every year, several thousand bills get introduced. Most go nowhere. Some are introduced only to sort of make a point with some narrow group of voters to try to get popularity for the sponsors. And of the 5,000 or 6,000 bills typically put into the hopper each year, only a few hundred get voted on, and a smaller number still become permanent law. So yes, there are many proposals, and they go in various different directions. And there are also pending issues coming out of court cases, because the social concern, and it's entirely understandable and justified, over costs, have led to many politicians grasping for ways to meet this problem. And they should be focusing on ways to meet the problem. As I said earlier, I think the worst way, and a legally improper way, is to misuse 1498, misuse the Bayh-Dole Marchin Rights, misuse compulsory licensing. So there's an awful lot at stake here, and it's impossible to tell which of these proposals may move forward. But the concern of the overall society and voters, of course, for this problem of high drug prices is so huge that bills that relate to trying to reduce drug prices have a greater chance of getting traction than ordinary bills do. So hard to predict, but I wouldn't rule out that some of these bills will move forward and possibly even pass.
Thank you, Lisa. Did you have anything else to add?
I don't. I think that was a very good summary. I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Well, then, my next question for Lisa is, how would less intellectual property protection or limited ability for a patent holder to be able to sue for damages if their property rights were infringed on, how would this affect certain technologies and investment in those technologies?
Sure. So obviously, as we've already been discussing, the industry already has a very high level of risk associated with it. And as we've said, it takes years and often a decade or more and millions, if not billions of dollars to develop a drug and take it to market. So if you're now adding this layer of uncertainty around patents and the risk of the government stepping in at some point to try and alter drug pricing, then they're giving the right for companies to essentially ignore patents and be immune from liability for infringement. And I think it begs the question, where is the incentive going to be for further innovation? And one of my big concerns, obviously patents have driven in innovation in this country. And as Judge Michelle said, we have been a leader in the biotech and pharma industry for years. And that is in part due to our strong and reliable and consistent patent system. But if the government starts to take patents away from owners and the US patent system is seen as weak or viewed as vulnerable, we really have to ask the question is, not only will the incentive for innovation be impacted, but will innovation begin to shift? Will it shift to Europe? Will it shift to China? And China is a big part of the conversation today. They have become innovators over the last decade. And I think that people need to have this as part of the conversation. And there's other countries where the patent system is viewed as consistent and stable and predictable. And so with a weakened patent system, if the incentive for innovation isn't there any longer, this is something the government really needs to consider when thinking about misconstruing and misusing Section 1498. As I mentioned, many technologies and their corresponding patents are improvements of what has already been discovered. There's, especially in this industry, there are very few pioneering inventions. Early on, what started really the industry was the recombinant DNA technology, which came out of Stanford and the University of California. But look at how that's developed over the years based on patents and designing around those patents and improving on those technologies. The same thing for pioneering technologies like PCR. And what we've seen, I think this is a really good example just in the last decade, is this field of gene editing. And even if people don't understand the details of this, I'm sure you've seen the headlines about the patent wars over gene editing, which is this CRISPR gene editing technology. And there's several parties, but basically the University of California and the Broad Institute have the core patents in that field. And they've been at war over certain patents and asking for millions of dollars in licenses for companies that want to use the technology. So what has happened, and I see it maybe more readily than other people because of the nature of my business. And so I see new inventions, every day. But every day now, people are designing around those patents. They're finding new enzymes. They're circumventing the original patents. And that's exactly what the patent system was meant to do. And in fact, just about 6 weeks ago, the lead CRISPR scientist from the Broad Institute published a paper on a new enzyme that he found, which has better precision and it's easier to deliver. Again, this is exactly what the patent system is supposed to do, is encourage innovation. And so we're seeing it in action. So there's this potential for pulling that away. What I mentioned earlier, and again, I think this is important, is we hear about the government being willing to give a reasonable compensation or royalty for drugs or biologics that are covered by a patent. But again, it assumes that this development process is very linear and almost takes place in a vacuum for one drug. But if you really understand the process and understand that it takes millions and millions of dollars, for example, for developing a platform technology to find new drugs. And perhaps there were 9 prior drugs in the pipeline that failed for a company, but now the 10th one is a success. So does reasonable compensation include the billions of dollars that were spent to ultimately get approval of that one drug? And I think this is very important and needs to be part of the conversation. It's very muddy. I don't think there are clear boundaries, and the government would really need to understand what reasonable compensation is, because the burden is going to be on the taxpayers to cover this, obviously. You asked one question, if this may affect certain diseases over others. I mean, I think it has the potential to affect all drugs and all diseases, but I think one of my concerns is the rare disease or orphan drug space. And that's probably because, first of all, an orphan or rare disease is defined in the US as less than 200,000. So obviously the investment in rare diseases means a lower return on your investment. The population is much smaller. But when, again, you think about, so most rare diseases, I think more than 80% have a genetic component, which means you have to have researchers understanding the genetic basis for these diseases. Once you do that, and again, you're millions of dollars down the road, you've got to develop diagnostics to see if patients have that genetic defect. And only then are you developing drugs to then address that genetic defect. So you've got diseases like cystic fibrosis or ALS. And I think those potentially could be impacted by this if there's not certain protections for these investors, similar to the other diseases. But I am concerned, I think, with that. And I know we're running low on time, but one final comment I do want to make is that it's possible, while a patent must disclose, and enable someone to follow the invention, there's often a lot of know-how and a lot of trade secrets, especially in the biologic space, that go into manufacture and development of these drugs. And so simply taking a patent and placing it with another company does not necessarily give that company the roadmap for recreating. And again, I think this pertains a little bit more to biologics. With a drug that can be chemically synthesized, it may be a little bit more direct. But I think this is something we really need to think about. Are we incentivizing people to hold back rather than disclose and keep things as trade secrets and keep things in-house as know-how? And what is that going to do to the future of innovation if we're not putting it out there, sort of opening up the kimono and showing what we've got? So there's so many issues here, and we could probably have 5 more discussions, but I'll leave it at that.
I think we already know the answer to Lisa's question, because the strength of patents has been eroding for the last 15 years in the United States, and it has spawned a flight of venture capital investment out of hard technology into things like entertainment, and even out of the US geographically to rival nations abroad, including even China. And then there's a point about timing that's important. Reference was made earlier about a patent term being 20 years and some legislators wanting to shorten that. the U.S. is bound by a treaty that we promoted and got 100 and some other countries to agree to, that stipulates that the term of a patent internationally has to be 20 years. So the people who say, well, let's cut it down to 5 because that'll save some money, are talking legal nonsense. We don't have that option. We're bound by a treaty that we proposed. The other thing on timing is that, as you could imply from what Lisa said, the biopharma industry is advancing rapidly, not only CRISPR, but all kinds of new technologies of enormous importance that go under broad names like immunotherapy, gene editing, et cetera, are on the cusp of turning into useful therapeutics. And so this is the worst time in the century to cut off the flow of investment money and stall out all that rapid progress that's going to be so important to human health.
Thank you. So I got a question in from a viewer, and the question essentially is, if the government's investing in clinical development, why shouldn't they be able to ask for fair pricing? I'm going to take a first pass at answering that and then ask my panelists to weigh in. That has nothing to do with intellectual property. An investor could say, in exchange for investing in your clinical development program, I want some sort of a guaranteed purchase agreement. I would say that would make the government a less attractive investor to a company relative to a private investor that wouldn't necessarily put that same stipulation. But I don't think that the connection to pricing or fair pricing has anything to do with it needs to have anything to do with intellectual property. And Paul or Lisa, do you want to correct me on my interpretation of that question and response?
No, I think you're correct, and it's kind of astonishing to me that there is such a lack of understanding in Congress of prior legislation passed by earlier Congresses. So proposals are being made publicly that are illegal, that are against the law that's been settled for many, many years in Congress and in the courts. So it seems to me that tracking down these impermissible pathways is not only bad policy that's going to be counterproductive for human health, but it's also illegal. So why would we want to do that?
Wonderful. Well, then my final question to the two of you is, if you had a wish for the upcoming year for bills that were being considered by Congress as it relates to intellectual property, what would be your wish? What would be a good policy change or a lack of a lack of issue that you would like to see in the coming year?
Ladies first.
I was going to let you go, given your expertise in this area. I mean, I will certainly echo Judge Michelle in that I feel that members of Congress and the government need to go back and look at the legislative history and go back and read about the Bayh-Dole Act and look at the impact that it's had on this industry, the positive effect. Hundreds of drugs have come to market since that was passed. To learn more about this industry in particular and understand the complexities, understand the patent world, meet with experts in the industry, meet with experts in intellectual property field, so that they can make well-informed and fact-based decisions. And, as Judge Michelle says, ones that are within the confines of the law. I mean, that would be my wish. I think it's a very sort of myopic view to think that misusing this statute 1498 is going to solve drug pricing or shortage issues, when there's so many other factors that need to be considered and other mechanisms that make more sense to control pricing. So I'll leave it at that.
So final thoughts, just too quickly. Congress also misunderstands the financial part of drug development. It is not true that the government pays for all this work. The government subsidizes a good deal of early stage, upfront, basic scientific research done in our great research universities, the best in the world, at least up to now. That part is true. But the follow-on stages of actually creating usable, safe, effective, sellable products is done almost entirely by the private sector. And the amount of money the private sector has to invest to carry those things forward often is huge multiples of the federal taxpayer investment in the upstream research. So the idea that, well, the taxpayers paid for this, so we should control it, is just false. It's just false economics. And I hope that that factual thing will get straightened out. And then finally, all threats to patent strength do not come from crazy ideas by politicians seeking popular approval. The courts have created huge problems, particularly the Supreme Court. So, for example, virtually all diagnostic inventions are now ineligible for patenting in the United States, even though they're eligible in every commercial competitive country throughout Europe and Asia, even in China. How crazy is that? We've tied our hands unnecessarily. So when you talk about legislation that could be harmful, that's one focus. Another focus is, well, what about legislation that would be helpful? There's a pending bill right now. I think it's extremely well thought out and written, co-sponsored in a bipartisan fashion by Senators Tillis and Coons, that would fix the problem of eligibility and put us on an even competitive playing field with Europe and Asia and China. And so the sapping of the incentives to invest in human health comes not only from errant proposals in Congress, but also from misunderstandings in the courts, who, like Congress, have no clue about how science really develops and about how it all gets financed. If they understood the world that Lisa is so aptly describing, they would realize that they've got to fix what the courts have wrecked, and they've got to avoid wrecking the whole system that's been such a smashing success for 43 years.
Thank you so much to both of my panelists. In addition to being a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, I worked in industry for over 20 years and I'm still a biopharma consultant, and I certainly learned a lot today from the two of them, and particularly about the history of intellectual property. I look forward to future discussions with AEI about this important topic. Thank you all for joining.